everybody, and I hope you're having a good lunch. It is that time of the week, that time of the day in the middle of the week. It's a good Wednesday here at Chatham Heights Baptist Church, and it's great to see all of you here, and great to hear stories from you about what's going on in your life right now. And I hope that you'll continue to tune in different places for our worship or for this study, or just letting us know what's happening in your lives along the way. We're going to get to our prayer concerns in a little while, but we began a study last week entitled From Promise to Exile. And it was a look at those books of the Bible that go from Joshua through Kings in the Old Testament. And we're kind of doing a survey, not necessarily a chapter by chapter, verse by verse kind of thing, but we're trying to do a survey to get a handle on the story from the Old Testament that might also reveal a little bit about ourselves, or where we have come from, or our faith has come from, and also perhaps a better understanding of how much we have in common with the people in the biblical story. And last week we began by looking in the book of Joshua and the story of Joshua, who was, of course, the leader who succeeded Moses and brought the children of Israel into the Promised Land and began the conquest of the Promised Land. And the book of Joshua does a lot of talking about how they began to take and conquer parts of the Promised Land along the way. There were some things that we discussed and looked at, and one of the things that we didn't quite get to, but I thought was rather interesting, is towards the end of the book of Joshua, certain things begin to become set up, if you will, within the Promised Land. And one of the major features of those last chapters is the difference between the land that they actually possessed and the land that was promised. In other words, in the book of Joshua, they do not possess all of the promised land, even by the end of it. There is a promise of how long and how far that land is to go, but they have not realized it in conquering it thus far. There are some different things that happen in terms of places, but one of the things that always got me is, according to the plan of Moses that Joshua was attempting to instigate or to create, is what were called refuge cities. In the 20th chapter of Joshua, you've discovered that there are certain cities that are assigned to the Levites in the 20th and 21st chapter. And those cities are intended to provide a safe haven of justice, and it's where we get the notion of sanctuary. First time I ever recall hearing or reading anything or experiencing anything in terms of literature or whatever, in terms of this church being a sanctuary. Sanctuary meaning a safe place from the rest of the world. And it was the notion that to make your way into the church, this is a Christian historical thing, that you would be protected from the crowd, the mob arrests, or vendetta. And that goes back to the Old Testament, when there was an understanding that the Levites, who are the priestly group in the tribes of Israel, would have select cities that they maintained, and their purpose was to house people, to protect them. One of the things of ancient peoples is the notion that of blood feud or vendetta. As a Hatfield, I kind of know those things. But the reality is that, they were very much a practice in ancient times. If you harmed one person's family, the whole family came after you. And they wouldn't stop till they got vengeance for their family. So one of the things that in the book of Joshua that's interesting is how things are apportioned to others, and that's one of the things that takes place. The other things that were happening a lot of times are there kind of sidebars of sidebars. Towards the end of Joshua, in the 24th chapter, there occurs 3 significant burials that take place. The first one is of Joshua himself. And there's almost a parallel to the Deuteronomy story of Moses and the death of Moses and the ending of the book of Joshua, kind of along the same lines that, uh, you know, we're told Joshua's lifespan was 110 years old, uh, just as Moses had been. 10 years, or actually 100 years old, 110 years old. 120 was what Moses has been. So 10 years difference in that thought. And he is buried in a sacred place, um, but it's in the Promised Land. Remember, Moses was not buried in the land of promise. But one of the things about Moses was that he did not get to go into the very land that he had proclaimed God had promised them and had rescued them from Egypt, leading the way with God's help along that way. He didn't get to go in. Well, Joshua, who did get to go in, when he dies, um, he doesn't see it all conquered. It's not all conquered at the end of Joshua's life. So it's still a place of fulfillment of promise and another place where parts of it are not fulfilled. The promise is not yet totally seen and fulfilled along the way. The second most interesting thing is that in that chapter is that Joseph, you remember Joseph way back in Genesis and that story of Joseph? For those of you who remember, it was during Joseph's time they invited his father Jacob and all of his brothers down into Egypt to be saved from a famine, and the result was that they were saved. But after so much time, and as they grew in numbers, there arose, the quote was, there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. And what that meant was that the Pharaohs began to feel more threatened by the Hebrews than, feeling friendly towards the Hebrews. And so they enslaved them. When Joseph died, the children of Israel, the Hebrews, kept the bones. And they were there, and when they left Israel in the Exodus, Egypt in the Exodus, and Moses is bringing them out, they bring Joseph's bones with them because they want to bury him in the Promised Land. That's where Jacob was buried. That's where Isaac was buried. That's where Abraham was buried. Well, by the 24th chapter, towards the end of Joshua, you get to see this. They inter or bury the bones of Joseph in a portion of ground that had been bought by Jacob at a place called Shechem. And so, in a sense, there's conclusion taking place. Ends are being wrapped up. Not totally, but it's there. And then Eleazar, who is the son of Aaron, Moses' brother, he succumbs to life and death, and he is buried in Ephraim. So it kind of ends on the death of three very important people, or the burial, I should say, of three important people: Joshua, the bones of Joseph, and Eleazar, who is kind of the lineage of the priestly caste of Aaron and Moses. So a lot of things happen there. Joshua, the book itself has a lot of interesting things to talk about and discuss along the way. One of the great themes that comes out is, of course, the covenant. There is a covenant that has been kept all along, or has been promised by God all along, that this is where you need to be in your relationship with me. And we've seen it played out when we studied Exodus and studied Deuteronomy and all those places. Well, by the central event of chapter 24, the covenant made by Joshua is to be continued. Now, the concept of a covenant is about a relationship. It's about a relationship with mutual obligation. God promises the children of Israel that God will sustain them and they will remain God's children because God has chosen them. Their part, the Hebrews, the children of Israel, their part is to maintain a constant and healthy relationship with Yahweh, with God. And how well they do or don't do that is going to be seen in these books that we're about to go through in just a little while, in this course of the study over the next weeks. Another thing that played out in Joshua a lot was about the land. Land means a lot in the book of Joshua. Walter Brueggemann, who you may recall if you had our Linton devotional guide, wrote the devotional guide, he wrote a book called The Land, in which he talked about land as the central theme of understanding faith and theology in the Bible. And he notes that the Israelites are without a place of their own in three different contexts: as sojourners in the beginning, in the ancient narratives, as wanderers in the wilderness, um, and as exiles later when they are conquered by Babylon. So there are three distinct times that the children of God don't really own anything. Uh, Abraham doesn't own anything. Neither does, in a sense, they're nomadic. Jacob, all of them don't really own much of anything. Um, then later on, they wander in the wilderness after God has rescued them from Egypt. And in that 40-year time, they don't own anything there either. And at the end, even after they've conquered the land, the covenant has been broken so badly by the children of Israel that God allows them to be taken captive and whisked away from the land of promise, and they don't own that. So Brueggemann always says, if you look at it, that's why the land is so important in the Bible to the children of Israel. The land is the promise that God is part of the big promise that God has given, at least in the way they looked at the Old Testament. But we discover the promise is really about more. It's about the promise of God to us, being with us, that will be fulfilled by the descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all of them. And that, of course, would be Jesus. But Yahweh is the landowner. And throughout the Old Testament stories that we read, and in a sense, that's an understanding of stewardship. All things belong to God, and that we are merely called to be stewards of them. And so for the children of Israel, they would forget that sometimes. For us, sometimes, we can forget that what we have is a blessing from God. It's on loan to us. And that's it. It's just on loan. And there, it can easily be forfeited, taken away. You can easily be dispossessed. And it can easily be forgotten generations later as well. God gives, but God can also take away. Israel's land is allocated according to the covenant. In other words, Israel has no inherent right to the land. It's not because they're Israel that they get to keep the land. It's whether or not they have kept covenant faith with Yahweh and with God. It's God's property, not theirs. So it's an understanding that just as it is promised, just as it is given, it can be lost, it can be taken away. And that, of course, is the way that things go. Now, one of the other questions that seems to arise, I think, a lot of times, particularly as we read these books in the Old Testament, why does God pick Israel? It's the mystery of God choosing. I don't know. God has that in the Bible. You see time and again, God sees something that we don't see, and what's more, God chooses to bless people that we ourselves would never bless. And by looking at their actions, we definitely can't see them blessing us. But God does. God, puts up with a lot, I guess I should say. And the mystery is that we don't really know. We just know that, the Bible tells us that God calls us. And that, God has something in mind for us. And so our response is not just, oh, look at me, I'm one of the chosen of God. Our response is that because God has called on me, because God has done something towards me, because God has blessed me, then I am assigned a mission from God. Now, what that mission is what we have to discover of God. And so one of the things that arises in the book of Joshua, and will arise later when we see a lot of the judges they're more anti-hero than hero. And then we'll look later into other people's lives, and even when we get to the establishment of the kingdom itself, with Saul, with David, etc. Um, we'll wonder why God chooses them, but God does. But it's important for us, if God has called us, that we pick up that mission. One other thing that always kind of vexes us, and vexes me at least, is the way in which, particularly in the Old Testament, there is a tension with the New regarding war. Um, in Joshua, cities are laid to waste, peoples are laid to waste. Many times, not all, but many times attributed that that's what God wants them to do, and so they do it. But how does that reconcile with what we know of Jesus? And that's always the question to ask ourselves. Because for us to, I think, really get a handle on God's will, we have to interpret things through the lens of Jesus. And Jesus really teaches anything but violence, retribution, war. But still, such things happen. And what does that mean to us? The guy who wrote this book, who was also a professor of mine at Southern Seminary, whose name is Marvin Tate, noted that he had written an article, and I went back to look at it because I had that copy. Southern used to publish 4 times a year a magazine. In fact, I think you might be able to see it right back there on this part right here, and way over there. The Review and Expositor, and in one particular that dealt with the issues of violence and war and what have you, Marvin Tate wrote an article about war. And he wrote this paragraph I thought was worth looking at to kind of help us maybe grapple with Old Testament, New Testament, with our faith and what we see played out. War, he said, is a dreadful evil and a scourge of humanity. If a Jew or a Christian does participate in war, it ought always to be with a heavy heart and a sense, really, of deep failure, knowing full well that the mission of the people of Yahweh should be that of peacemakers and not warriors. On the other hand, we ought not to try to banish the divine warrior from our theological heritage. He has used war to accomplish his purposes in history, at times against his own people, and he may do so again. We dare not make absolutes out of either violence or nonviolence, war or peace. But our mission is to be clear. We're to move towards the vision of justice and peace, which the divine warrior has given to his people. For the divine warrior is also our loving Heavenly Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. So it helps us to understand and to play out the recognition that, war is the consequence of a sinful world, and it is never to be entered into with zeal or zest, but really as a failure for our ability to live with one another and find just and peaceful means of settlement. That's the book of Joshua for you. It's not exactly John Derrick from the movie Ten Commandments, but it's a really good peek into how the early part of Israel trying to come into the Promised Land plays out. Now, the next book that we're looking at is one of my favorites, actually, because it has a lot of narratives, a lot of stories about a lot of people. Following the death of Joshua, the book of Judges comes along and records this mosaic of stories and episodes about life in Canaan, between the incomplete conquest of the Promised Land and the rise eventually of having a king, or the monarchy. Like the Exodus generation of Israelites who died in the wilderness, who had known slavery but died while they were out there wandering in the wilderness. The generation of Israelites who crossed the river Jordan under Joshua's leadership had gone into the promised land. They die in the midst of unfinished work. Some of the land is theirs, some of it is not. And there's no Moses or Joshua left now. So what happens is different leaders began to rise up. And in rising up, they come at critical times, critical moments, and in a crisis. And the result is that their leadership is important to keeping the children of Israel connected to God and God's promise and their fulfillment of following God's promise. The stories that we're going to encounter kind of represent a lot of what will happen in the story of Israel from the promise to the exile. There'll be these moments of great crisis, these moments of returning to the faith and to God for deliverance, and God raises up someone and God delivers them, and then they go back to their old ways. And then the cycle repeats. The book provides, in a lot of ways, we'll discover, the reason and the rationale for the monarchy, for having kings instead of just being a confederation. That's what they were until the kings came. It was a confederation of tribes. They were the 12 tribes. And those tribes had their own land, and they weren't really united by being children of Israel. They kind of became very tribal, with each other. Some groups didn't like the other parts of the family. Nothing's new there, I suppose. But it helps us understand that one of the reasons we can kind of surmise that these stories of Judges are there, and they're kind of compiled later when the kingdom is established, when there are kings, when there is a Jerusalem, when there are things going on in that respect, because there is a phrase that pops up in the book of Judges. In those days there was no king in Israel, and then it would go on to tell you about the judges. That is an expression that it will come again and again, and then later in Judges will come out the expression, all the people did what was evil in their own eyes. And again, it's that cycle thing. The outline of the book, in the first couple of chapters, they really kind of serve as two distinct beginnings or prologues. The first beginning follows the death of Joshua, and the Israelites are lost. If we don't have Joshua, who's going to take care of the Canaanites for us? And Judah stands up and decides they will lead. And these little vignettes start taking place. A guy named Caleb and his daughter, who would become the wife of Othniel, who will be a future judge, rises up, and they have success. Judah conquers a lot of the south, their territory. Judah will make up the largest landmass of the future kingdom of Israel, and will be kind of the prized pigs at the county fair among the tribes of Israel. In fact, so much so that when Israel's kingdom will split after Solomon, it will be Judah and Jerusalem, and then the northern kingdom will be its own. And Judah's not a whole lot smaller than the northern kingdom. So there is obviously dissension that happened even way before that break. One of the things that happens, we're told in the first chapter, is that with Judah's success of conquering their land, they took the native peoples, the Canaanites that were there, and we are told in the latter part of that first chapter that the Canaanites are put to forced labor after the Israelites have grown strong. That's human, isn't it? Here is a people that were enslaved for 400 years in Egypt, and who were freed by the hand of God from Egypt, saved and delivered through the obstacles of the Red Sea, the wilderness, and now we're being given a land of promise. And as soon as they have the chance, they start making slaves. They become what they fled, taskmasters. We have a tendency in human nature to be riled against something, and then the minute that something is for us or about us or something we are advantageous with, it is the minute we turn into that which we once loathed. Uh, it, it takes a good relationship with God to beware of those things, to look after those things. Um, More continues. Some of the tribes are successful, some are not. For example, the tribe of Dan will take on the Amorites, and the result is they don't win. They're not in good shape. They get driven back into the hills away from the prime part of land that had been promised the Danites. And we'll get to hear about them a little bit later on. So this new generation that didn't know the Lord or the work that had been done for Israel, that phrase is interesting because you may recall in the Exodus, a Pharaoh arose that knew not Joseph. That meant he didn't know who Joseph was, didn't know the story of the Hebrews, didn't care. And in this case, you got children of Israel who didn't know the story of how they got there, and even if they did, they didn't care. It was an ancient story. They only cared about now. Can you see some parallels here? I think you can. On a personal level, on a corporate level, you can see a lot of these. And then you get the start of the judges by the end of the second chapter, and what becomes a pattern, as I mentioned before. It starts with an event where there's disloyalty to God. They maybe worship other gods, and the result is they become oppressed by their enemies, and they can't win. And then suddenly God intervenes and raises up a leader or a judge to deliver them, and then they return and relapse back to the bad behavior. There are 7 judges in the first 10 chapters that are talked about. I mentioned Othniel earlier. He will deliver the Israelites from a king in Canaan whose name was Double Trouble. That's how it translates. Would you like to be ruled by King Double Trouble? Sometimes I think we are. But the others, there are really people we don't know, or we don't really hear a lot about. They're there, the stories are there, but we don't pay much attention, like Ehud of the tribe of Benjamin, who all we know about him really is he's a left-handed man, and he ends up conquering Moab and killing King Eglaon. And then there is Shamgar, who all we know is he uses an ox goad to kill 600 Philistines. So, some of these guys have these kind of moments. Now, the first one in the 4th chapter that we kind of maybe know about, and one of the most intriguing ones, is Deborah. And Deborah will show up, and she will do some interesting things in front of us. And we're going to talk about her in more detail in a minute. And followed her was Gideon, who I know you've heard that word. If nothing else, you've probably got a copy of the Gideon Bible, but that has nothing to do with this Gideon. Then there were 2 others, Tola of Ishkar and Jair of Gilead, whom we know about that is he had 30 towns, 30 sons, and rode 30 donkeys. It's amazing what becomes leadership sometimes. 5 others are mentioned, and none of them, some of them really don't end up in the best places. Perhaps the worst is Jephthah. He is from Gilead. And we'll talk about him in a little while too, so I don't want to give it away. Ibzan of Bethlehem, who also had 30 sons, all of whom married non-Israelite wives. Elon of Zebulun, Abdon of Ephraim, who had 40 sons and 30 grandsons and rode 70 camels. 70 donkeys, not camels. And then one of the last ones we'll hear about, actually the last judge, will be Samson, who everybody remembers Samson. We'll talk about him a little bit later too. And then as the tribes begin to disintegrate into chaos and sniping at each other, not just the people that they're trying to take their land, but for the promise, but they start sniping at each other, even though they're family. We're gonna discover a guy by the name of Micah, and we'll talk about his story, which to me is always one of the more fascinating ones. Um, the judges, the term judge means a few things. It refers to a person who is governing. To govern is to be a judge in the Hebrew word usage, to rule. But in the book of Judges, often the word also is identified with deliverer or savior. These liberators are raised up in these moments. And there are three major types of deliverance that seem to happen. One is that they are given freedom from the threat of some various Canaanite city-states that are around them. That kind of goes without saying. The story of Deborah and Barak are going to be an example of that. A second kind of deliverance is from the oppression by peoples on the perimeters of the land. Gideon, Jephthah, and then there's a deliverance that sometimes happens from the main competitors with the Israelites in the hill country, such as Shamgar and Samson, who take on the Philistines. But let's talk about a few of them because there's some interesting things there, and I want to let you know I'm going to use my good old buddy Frederick Buechner. Buechner wrote years ago, and it's one of my favorite books, Peculiar Treasures. And it's really a list of a lot of the people in the Bible. And it's his own literary kind of descriptive tone that he writes about these people. And some of them are definitely prevalent in the book of Judges. And so I want you to hear kind of a different slant or take sometime here in our studies about these stories. Maybe see something that we didn't think of before. The first one we encounter is, given to us in kind of two forms. In the 4th chapter of Judges, we are introduced to Deborah and Barak. And it is a prose narrative. In other words, it's written in prose. It's just a narrative of their story, leading as judges and what happened in that crisis. And then in the 5th chapter, there's a song. It's a song we're told that Deborah wrote, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. But it is a song about what they accomplished in the name of Yahweh. Deborah's a prophet. That's right, a woman who is a prophet who judges Israel while sitting under her palm tree in the hill country of Ephraim, somewhere between Ramah and Bethel. And she summons Barak to lead the Israelite warriors. And their Canaanite counterparts are some generals by the name of Jabin and Sisera. Sisera was probably the military leader of the coalition, between Canaanites and Philistines that had come together. What is her role in this? A little ambiguous when we read chapter 4. She's just a prophet, but she seems to tell Barak this is what they need to do militarily. And Barak says, I'll take the army and do that, but I won't do it unless you come with us. And Barak insists, and so Deborah says, sure, I'll go with you. So what is her actual military role? Well, we're not totally sure. Barak seems to be the general, but she seems to be perhaps like the Eisenhower, commander-in-chief of the expeditionary force, and then subordinates like Bradley and Montgomery and Patton and these others are the generals in charge of the various corps and army groups. So, that's probably in that way. So it's interesting how powerful this is. It's a powerful place for a woman in this time, and that God would choose a woman. Well, sometimes we need to realize that sometimes women are put down not by God, but by society and people. And that God's busy picking women to fulfill leadership roles. That some of us have said, well, you can't do that. God says, watch me. And he does that with Deborah in particular. Now, in Peculiar Treasures, this is what Buechner wrote and had to say. So lend me your ear for a minute, if you would. Deborah was Israel's only woman judge. She looked like Golda Meir and did business under a palm tree. And her business consisted of more than just stepping in and settling things when people got into a wrangle. Like all the other judges of Israel, she was loaded with charisma, and whenever there was any fighting to be done, she was the one who was ultimately in charge. Even generals jumped when she snapped her fingers. Barak, for instance. She summoned him to the palm tree and told him she wanted him to take 10,000 of his best men and beat the stuffing out of the Canaanite forces under a general by the name of Sisera. Barak said he'd do it, but indicated he'd feel more secure if Deborah came along. She said she would, and she also said it was only fair to warn him, however, that the main glory of the day was going to be not his, but a woman's, because a woman was going to be the one to wipe out Sisera. In addition to her other hats, Deborah was also something of a prophet and had pronounced obvious feminist sympathies. Her prediction turned out to be correct, of course, and Barak won the battle, but Sisera was disposed by a lady by the name of Jael, and we'll talk about her next week, in a rather spectacular way that'll be read about later on. And afterwards, Deborah wrote a song to help spread the word around and give credit where credit was due. It's a wonderful song. That's chapter 5, by the way. Full of blood and thunder, with a lot of hair-raising, bitter jibes at the end of it about how Sisera's old mother sits waiting at the window for her son to come home, not knowing that Jael has already made mincemeat of him. Deborah composed it, and she got Barak to sing it with her. Barak, Buechner writes, looked like Moshe Dayan, and it must have been quite a duet. The song brushes by Barak's role rather hastily, but describes Jael's in lavish detail and must have gotten her all the glory a girl could possibly want. Yahweh himself gets a plug at the end when he sings, "So perish all thine enemies, O Lord." But by and large, the real hero of Deborah's song is, well, it's Deborah. Everything was going to pot, the lyrics say, until you arose, Deborah, arose a mother in Israel. And you can't help feeling that Deborah's basic message was that mother was the one who really saved the day. And of course, with Yahweh's help, she was. You know, it's hard not to bridle a little at the idea that her standing under the palm tree, belting out her own praises like that. But after all, she had a country to run, a war to fight, and she knew that without a good press, she was licked from the start. Besides, maybe the more self-congratulatory parts of her song were the ones that she actually assigned to Barak. An interesting look at Deborah and her story. And we discover that God uses some interesting judges. We're going to talk about the story of Jael and the demise of the enemy general Sisera next week. We're going to leave here and to look at it that way next week, because we're kind of at the end of our time. And it's just, I hope that you'll love to hear some of these stories and maybe see ourselves in what God is doing, and how surprising God can be picking some people sometime. One of the things we're going to discover, and I hope you do, when we look at these people and judges, particularly this week and next week, is what's the word I'm looking for? The amazement I have that God picks what we would now classify as anti-heroes. An anti-hero is a person who acts like a hero, but they're really not that good of a guy or girl. So, yet God uses them. And so it's an interesting thought. So right now we want to take a look at our prayer concerns, and as I look down at these, I know I missed some people, and I want you to think about them. If you you're getting a newsletter during the week. If you'll take a look at our prayer concerns that are listed there, um, that would be very, very helpful to keep you in touch with people. Please remember Mary Helen Cameron. Her mother passed away a week ago. Um, she is going to be buried in Jackson, Tennessee, and David and Mary Helen are going to be going there, leaving May 6th and coming back May 10th to take care of that. So please remember them in your prayers if you would. Jimmy Lewis had those tests a week ago, and it's not his heart, but they don't really know what's going on. So they're going to do some further testing and talking to doctors and physicians about what might be happening. Continue to remember Matt Fouts in Houston as they continue to try to pin down the specific origin and type of cancer. They've got a good idea it's a carcinoma, but they're not positive 100% yet. So they're going to go ahead and do radiation on the leg. If you're Facebook friends with them, my wife couldn't get over, and yet I wasn't totally surprised by watching him. There was a little brief video. I don't know if Hyla recorded it or what, but he was in the therapy room, and he was doing push-ups one-legged in order to keep his broken leg, which has been plated and put in a brace cast in his thigh, he keeps it on top of his other leg that he can put weight on and does push-ups. He's a strength coach in Franklin County, and I understand, but Lord have mercy, Matt, you put the rest of us to shame, buddy. But we're praying for him and his strength and for the family as well. Charlene Atkins, who's been getting over a virus, her father is in the hospital and not doing all that well, and hoping that she's now able to get in to see him, where she had the virus that she couldn't before. Not COVID, just a bug. So if you would remember him in prayer and the family as well. I mentioned Sunday, and I don't know that you caught it or not, but many of you know who Kevin Ford is. Roy Ford was the interim pastor here at Chatham Heights Baptist Church between Bob Bailey and myself. And Roy was a pastor in the area for a long time, and then he joined his father and his paving business that has long been prevalent here. Roy's now retired, but his son Kevin Adams Construction took that business, but Kevin is one of the people who works supervisory in that. And Kevin's been here, visited more than a few times in the past 20 years I've been here, but great guy, great family. His daughter had a very terrible car wreck. Michaela is her name, and a serious accident, is in the hospital. She has shown some progression in the ICU, but she's not out of the woods. She's still in critical shape. So I ask that you would lift Michaela up in your prayers and the family as well at this time. Also remember, I saw where a gentleman was killed on a motorcycle just this week. A lot of people, a lot of tragedies around us. Remember those who are recovering from surgeries for us, Charles Lewis, Susan Hampton, Dave Maddox. We got some pending surgery. Smitty, who let me know it is his knee and not his hip that is being replaced on May 10th. Sorry about that, Smitty. But I can't keep everybody's hips and knees together. We got a lot of everything. And Shirley Hyatt, who's going to be having a pacemaker defibrillator put in soon. Ralph Stultz has had some serious nerve pain issues, and after a battery of different tests and consulting with the doctor, basically he was told news that they can't do anything. If they were to operate, it would not relieve pain. If anything, it would create more pain. And so his arms and his shoulders may need surgery, but they're not going to do it because it would only exacerbate the nerve problems in his legs and everywhere, and up around his neck. So if you would remember Ralph, he is working hard to keep as loose as he can now and trying to walk and exercise more to keep it from getting worse. So if you remember he and Penny as well, and I'm sure there are many, many others along the way. Let's together pray. Also, a quick reminder, child dedication is May 9th. Looking forward to that in our 10 o'clock service. Also, On May the 15th, from 11 to 1 o'clock, there is a drive-by wedding shower, bridal shower, for Eric Catherine Hall here at the church. You would just drive through here in the front part, over by the education building. AC will be there, family will be there, servants. They'll be handing out cupcakes. I know that much. And they will be, it's just a chance to bring blessings upon this young lady who we've all seen grow up over these years, and think very highly of. Um, Tim and Mary's, daughter. Um, so let's bow together in our prayer time. Lord, please, we ask for your presence to be made known in so many lives. I'm thinking of other people that I failed to mention just now, and I just pray you be with them as they're finding out things in their own life, in their own body, what's going on. I lift up, Lord, all of these individuals that are facing so many difficulties, some of them, Lord, in the critical mass area of life. And so we pray and lift them and their families as they care for them. Heavenly Father, I just ask that you would just be with each of us, strengthening us, leading us to be faithful to you, because you have been so faithful to us. And in the living name of the living Christ, we offer ourselves and our prayers right now. Amen. Look forward to worshiping with you on Sunday, here in person, online, wherever. Great to see you. May God bless your journeys this week.